There are moments in life when human curiosity exceeds the limits of prudence, leading ordinary people to explore obscure territories that perhaps should remain untouched. This is the story of 5 Boston University students who, driven by a mixture of youthful skepticism and fascination with the supernatural, decided to challenge one of the most disturbing urban legends in modern folklore, the 3 a.m. clock ritual. What began as a weekend prank on a university campus quickly transformed into a nightmare that would forever change their perceptions of reality. No one could have predicted that a simple internet search about paranormal rituals would lead this group of friends to discover an ancient procedure that supposedly allowed communication with the other side during the so-called Devil's Hour, that moment in the early morning when the veil between worlds would be at its thinnest. The legend said that, if performed correctly, the ritual would allow participants to make a wish that would be granted by forces beyond human comprehension. Jason Miller, a 22-year-old psychology student known for his skepticism and rationality, was the first to suggest that the group test the ritual, convinced that he could explain any resulting phenomena through scientific principles such as collective suggestion or pareidolia. His best friend, Sarah Thompson, a cultural anthropology student with an interest in urban folklore, quickly joined the plan, seeing it as an opportunity to study firsthand how modern legends affect human behavior. The other 3, Michael Chen, a pragmatic engineering student, Olivia Parker, an aspiring filmmaker who wanted to document the experience, and Daniel Rodriguez, a literature student with a fascination for the macabre, completed the group that frequently met in Jason's apartment to plan what they called their supernatural experiment. As they deepened their research, they discovered versions of the ritual in different cultures, all pointing to 3 a.m. as a moment of supernatural significance. They found disturbing accounts in obscure internet forums, stories of people who tried the ritual and later reported inexplicable experiences, from objects that moved by themselves to visions of shadowy entities that remained even after the ritual ended. Some testimonies mentioned more serious consequences, disappearances, unexplained deaths, and cases of possession. The group treated these reports as exaggerations or fabrications, typical of internet folklore. They decided that the ideal location to conduct the experiment would be the old Blackwood mansion, abandoned for decades on the outskirts of the city after the mysterious death of the entire family that once resided there. What they didn't know was that the choice of that specific location was no coincidence. Something was already guiding them, setting the stage for what was to come. It all began on an autumn night in Jason's dormitory, when the group of friends, bored with conventional university parties, decided to explore supernatural themes for entertainment. "What if we tried something different this weekend?" suggested Jason, browsing through an obscure forum about paranormal phenomena. "Look at this. The 3 a.m. clock ritual, the Devil's Hour." Silence took over the room as everyone leaned in to read the computer screen. The ritual seemed simple, but the warnings were severe. Performing it incorrectly could open doors that should never be opened. Sarah, always the most curious of the group, was the first to show genuine interest, arguing that it would be a fascinating anthropological experience. "Think of it as a case study on collective suggestion," she said, already taking notes in her research notebook. Michael, initially the most skeptical, crossed his arms and laughed. "You really believe in this nonsense? It's just another urban legend created to scare teenagers." Subscribe to the channel right now for more chilling stories like this. Turn on the bell to never miss a video. Olivia, who always carried her camera, saw a perfect opportunity for her documentary project on contemporary beliefs. "We can film everything," she suggested enthusiastically. "Even if nothing happens, we'll have interesting material about how expectation affects perception." Daniel, who had been quiet until then, flipping through an old book on occultism he had bought at a used bookstore, finally spoke. "Did you know that in various cultures, 3 a.m. is considered the moment when the veil between worlds is thinnest? The ancient Romans called it hora in tempesta, the timeless hour." His words brought a collective shiver to the group. In the following days, they deepened their research, finding variations of the ritual in different traditions. Some accounts mentioned missing people. Others spoke of wishes granted with terrible consequences, like the story of a man who asked for wealth and the next day received an enormous inheritance after the tragic death of his entire family. The more they researched, the more fascinated they became, especially when they discovered the Blackwood Mansion. Built in 1887 by a wealthy industrialist with an interest in occultism, the property had a history filled with inexplicable tragedies. The Blackwood family had mysteriously disappeared in 1956 after reports of strange behavior and claims that they were conducting experiments with time. The mansion had remained abandoned since then, with occasional reports of strange lights and unexplained sound. "It's the perfect place," declared Jason, showing his friends old photos of the mansion on his laptop. "Isolated, with supernatural history, and technically we won't be trespassing since the property has been in legal dispute for decades." Sarah researched more about the Blackwood family and discovered something disturbing. The patriarch, Edmund Blackwood, had written extensively about a ritual that supposedly allowed communication with entities from another temporal plane precisely at 3 a.m. On the Friday before the planned ritual, strange events began to occur. Michael found an old clock on his desk that didn't belong to him, stopped exactly at 3 o'clock. Olivia began to have recurring nightmares about a house she had never visited, but instantly recognized when Jason showed photos of the Blackwood mansion. Daniel found pages of his occult book stuck together, and when he managed to separate them, discovered a diagram identical to the one described in the ritual they planned to perform. Sarah began receiving phone calls at 3 a.m. When she answered, she heard only static and occasionally what seemed to be breathing. None of them mentioned these incidents to the others, each fearing to appear superstitious or afraid. On the night before the ritual, they gathered to finalize preparations, each bringing the necessary items: black candles, sea salt, an antique mirror that Sarah found in her house's basement, and the mysterious clock that had appeared to Michael. What they didn't realize was that they were already being watched and that the ritual had begun much earlier than they imagined. On Saturday night, the five friends met in an abandoned supermarket parking lot, about 2 kilometers from the Blackwood mansion. The plan was to leave their cars there and follow the dirt path leading to the property on foot, avoiding drawing attention. "Did everyone bring their personal objects?" asked Jason, checking his backpack one last time. Each of them had chosen something significant. Jason brought his grandfather's pocket watch, Sarah a small tribal amulet she had received during a study trip. Michael chose his first electronic circuit prototype. Olivia brought a tape from her first camera, and Daniel a page from the manuscript he was writing. "Remember, according to the instructions, these objects serve as anchors to bring us back in case." "Well, in case something goes wrong," explained Sarah, trying to maintain a scientific tone despite the obvious nervousness in her voice. As they walked along the dark trail, illuminated only by the flashlights on their phones, Daniel recited the rules they had memorized. "The ritual must begin at exactly 2:55. No one can leave the salt circle until 3:33. We cannot break eye contact with the mirror when the clock strikes 3. And most importantly, we must not respond to any voice or sound that doesn't come from one of us. Leave your like and share with your friends. Comment if you would have the courage to perform this ritual." The Blackwood mansion appeared before them like a gigantic shadow against the night sky, its broken windows looking like empty eyes, observing their approach. The Victorian structure, once majestic, was now slowly deteriorating, with ivy covering much of the facade and the roof partially collapsed in one of the wings. "It looks exactly like in my dreams," whispered Olivia, adjusting her camera as a shiver ran down her spine. They entered through the back door, which was strangely unlocked, as if the house had been waiting for them. The interior smelled of mold and decay, but also of something more difficult to identify, a metallic odor, almost like ozone after a storm. Michael, always practical, began checking the stability of the floor and stairs. "We need to find a safe room, preferably on the first floor in case we need to leave quickly." After a brief exploration, they chose what appeared to have been a living room, with a large central space and walls covered by wooden panels darkened by time. As they prepared the location, removing debris and cleaning the floor to draw the salt circle, Sarah noticed noticed symbols discreetly carved into the wooden panels, marks that disturbingly resembled the diagrams they had studied for the ritual. Jason consulted his watch. 2:30 a.m. "We have 25 minutes to finish preparations," he announced, trying to keep his voice steady. Olivia positioned her camera on a tripod, making sure it would capture the entire circle. Daniel carefully spread the coarse salt in a perfect circle, large enough to accommodate all 5 seated. In the center, they placed the antique clock and around it, the 5 black candles at equidistant points. Michael, who had brought a digital thermometer at his own insistence, frowned as he checked the device. "The temperature has dropped almost 10 degrees in the last 5 minutes. This doesn't make sense without a change in the ventilation system." No one responded, but everyone felt the sudden cold that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. At 2:50, they took their places inside the circle, each holding their personal object in one hand, and in the other, a small hand mirror that Sarah had brought, 5 fragments of a larger mirror that she had broken specifically for the ritual. "Remember," she said, her voice now little more than a whisper, "anything we see or hear after 3 o'clock is not real, or at least not of this world. Don't respond, don't react. Just keep focus on the mirror and the words of the ritual." At exactly 2:55, Jason lit the first candle and began to recite the ancient words they had found in their research, a mixture of Latin and something older that none of them could fully identify. As each repeated the words, lighting their own candle, the atmosphere in the room subtly changed. The air seemed to become denser, almost viscous, and external sounds, the wind in the trees, the occasional creaks of the old house, were gradually replaced by an oppressive silence, as if time itself was slowing down around them. Sarah was the first to notice the shadows on the walls, which seemed to move independently of the candlelight, elongating and contorting into shapes that didn't correspond to any of those present. Michael felt increasing pressure in his ears, as if rapidly descending from altitude. Daniel noticed that the words of the ritual, which initially seemed strange on his tongue, now flowed naturally, as if he had always known them. Olivia, observing through her camera lens while participating, noticed that the image occasionally distorted, briefly showing unfamiliar faces among those of her friends. And Jason, leading the ritual, felt a growing connection with the clock at the center, as if each tick-tock reverberated inside his own chest, synchronizing with his heartbeats as the hands inexorably approached 3 a.m. When the antique clock finally struck 3 o'clock, an absolute silence took over the environment. The 5 friends, seated in a circle, kept their eyes fixed on their mirrors as the ritual instructed. It was at this moment that the first inexplicable phenomenon occurred. The clock in the center stopped for exactly 1 second, its hands trembling slightly before continuing their mechanical movement. "It's beginning," thought Sarah, feeling a current of cold air run down her neck, despite there being no open windows. In the mirrors, each began to notice subtle distortions in their own reflections, eyes that blinked when theirs did not, smiles that didn't correspond to their tense expressions. Michael, always the skeptic, tried to rationalize what he saw, attributing the anomalies to the flickering candlelight and his own fatigue. But when his reflection slightly tilted its head to the side in a mechanical and unnatural movement, while he remained perfectly still, the young engineer felt the first genuine chill of fear. Olivia, through her strategically positioned camera, captured what her eyes couldn't directly see: dense shadows that seemed to materialize in the corners of the room, slowly converging toward the circle like predators surrounding their prey. Subscribe now and turn on notifications to discover what happened to these young people. You won't want to miss the next video. Daniel was the first to hear the whispers. Initially so low they seemed just like the wind, but gradually becoming more distinct. "Daniel, we know what you hide. We know what you really desire." The voice sounded strangely familiar, like that of his mother who had passed away when he was a child. His fingers tightly gripped the page of his manuscript as he fought against the impulse to respond. Jason, in turn, began to feel increasing pressure in his chest, as if the air was slowly being extracted from the room. In his mirror, he saw not only his reflection but briefly, shadowy figures moving behind him, watching over his shoulders with eyes that seemed to glow with their own light. The clock in the center now seemed to pulse with its own energy, its hands moving at normal speed, but somehow marking time incorrectly, as if each second lasted as long as a minute, stretching the experience into an agonizing eternity. Sarah noticed that the candles, although still lit, lit now produced bluish flames that didn't flicker with the air currents, but moved in circular patterns, as if dancing around something invisible. At 3:15, as indicated by the clock, although it seemed that hours had passed, the phenomena intensified dramatically. The temperature dropped even further, to the point where their breaths formed small clouds of condensation. The personal objects in the center of the circle began to vibrate subtly, and Daniel's manuscript slowly unrolled by itself, revealing words he had never written, ancient symbols that seemed to change shape as they were observed. Olivia noticed that her camera now captured distorted images, as if the reality around them was being bent. At one point, she saw through the lens something that almost made her scream. For a brief moment, there weren't 5, but 6 people sitting in the circle, with an additional figure positioned directly behind Jason, its features impossible to distinguish in the half-light. Michael, who had brought his electronic prototype, noticed that the device now emitted a low, constant hum, its LEDs flashing in a sequence he had never programmed. Sarah's amulet began to heat up in her hand, almost burning her skin, while in the mirror she saw not her own face, but that of a much older woman, with eyes that seemed to contain knowledge of centuries. Jason, feeling that the ritual was reaching its critical point, remained firm in reciting the final words, his voice now accompanied by a strange echo that didn't seem to come from any specific place in the room. It was then that they all heard it, a sound of knocking, like someone knocking on a distant door, followed by slow, dragging footsteps that seemed to come from all directions at once. The shadows on the walls now moved with definite purpose, forming humanoid silhouettes that observed the group with predatory curiosity. "Let us in," whispered a voice directly in Daniel's ear, so real and close that he could feel the cold breath on his skin, despite no one being physically near him. "Just say yes, and we will fulfill your greatest desire." Sarah realized what was happening and, without breaking her own concentration, extended her hand to touch Daniel's shoulder, silently reminding him of the most important rule, not to respond, no matter how convincing the temptation. Meanwhile, the clock in the center now marked 3:25, and the atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. The air seemed dense like water, the sounds distorted as if they were submerged, and reality itself seemed fragile, like thin glass about to shatter under the pressure of something much larger and older, trying to force its entry into our world. At 3:30, the ritual reached its peak. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with a palpable energy, while the 5 friends remained firm in their circle of protection. It was then that Michael, whose skepticism had been gradually eroded by the inexplicable events, made the fatal mistake. A voice identical to that of his deceased brother whispered directly in his ear, "Mike, I've been trapped here for so long. Please help me get out." The engineer, momentarily forgetting the rules of the ritual, instinctively turned toward the voice. "Jake," he murmured, breaking both eye contact with the mirror and the prescribed silence. In the same instant, a catastrophic change occurred in the atmosphere of the room. The circle of salt around Michael began to dissipate as if blown by an invisible wind, and a sensation of absolute horror took hold of the other 4 participants when they saw a dense shadow materialize behind their friend. Before anyone could react, Michael abruptly stood up, knocking over his candle and completely breaking the circle. "Something's wrong. I need to get out of here," he shouted, running toward the door. Jason tried to reach him, but Sarah held him firmly. "Don't break the circle," she implored, her face pale with terror. "If we all leave now, we'll be lost." The moment Michael crossed the threshold of the door, all the candles went out simultaneously, plunging the room into near total darkness, with only the ghostly light of the moon entering through the broken windows. The clock in the center of the circle began to spin its hands at impossible speed, first clockwise, then counterclockwise, emitting a high-pitched metallic sound that pierced the eardrums. The personal objects in the center began to twist and transform, as if being manipulated by invisible hands. Daniel's manuscript spontaneously ignited, the green flames consuming the paper without producing smoke. Sarah's amulet cracked in half with an audible snap. Michael's electronic prototype imploded, scattering small pieces across the floor. Olivia's tape unwound violently, serpentining through the air as if alive, and Jason's pocket watch opened, its internal mechanism disassembling assembling and reassembling itself in impossible configuration. From the corridor, they heard Michael's terrified scream, followed by an abrupt and complete silence that seemed even more frightening than any sound. Leave your like and comment if you've ever felt a supernatural presence. Share your experiences below. The four remaining friends, paralyzed by fear but determined to complete the ritual, remained in what was left of the salt circle, now partially broken. Olivia, trembling uncontrollably, noticed through her camera, which inexplicably continued to function, that the shadows in the room had gained substance, now moving like three-dimensional creatures that slid along the walls and ceiling, occasionally extending elongated appendages toward the circle, only to retreat upon touching the invisible barrier that still protected them. Daniel began to bleed from his nose, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the mirror where he no longer saw his reflection, but rather a succession of unknown faces, some human, others decidedly not. Sarah, frantically reciting the words of protection she had memorized, noticed that the floor beneath them had begun to change, the patterns of the wood reorganizing into arcane symbols that pulsed with their own light. Jason, maintaining himself as leader even at the height of terror, continued to count the minutes, knowing they needed to resist until 3:33 to properly end the ritual. Just 2 more minutes, he whispered, his voice almost unrecognizable. When the clock finally struck 3:33, a wave of energy seemed to emanate from the center of the circle, rapidly expanding and dissipating the shadows that surrounded them. The candles relit simultaneously, and for a brief moment, everyone felt a sensation of relief. The ritual had ended. But when Jason called for Michael, only silence answered. The four friends, exhausted and traumatized, gathered courage to search for their missing colleague. With improvised flashlights from their cell phones, they searched every room of the abandoned mansion, desperately calling for Michael. They found no sign of him, no footprints in the thick dust that covered the floor of the corridors, nor any indication of struggle or forced escape. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. At dawn, they were forced to leave the mansion without their friend, agreeing to contact the authorities as soon as they were at a safe distance. But in the days that followed, they discovered that something much more disturbing had happened. No one besides them seemed to remember Michael. His photos in graduation albums had disappeared, his social media profile no longer existed, and even his parents, when contacted, seemed genuinely confused, insisting they never had a son named Michael. It was as if he had been completely erased from reality. Even more frightening were the changes that each of the survivors began to notice in their own lives. Jason began to wake up at exactly 3 a.m. every night, finding his grandfather's watch, which he had left in the mansion, mysteriously back on his bedside table. Sarah began to see reflections of strangers in mirrors and reflective surfaces, figures that observed her and occasionally tried to communicate. Daniel discovered that his manuscript, supposedly destroyed during the ritual, reappeared every morning on his desk, with new pages added containing texts in unknown languages and disturbing diagrams. And Olivia, reviewing the footage from that night, discovered that her camera had captured not only what happened in the room, but also events in other rooms of the house where the camera had never been, including fragmented images of what appeared to be Michael being dragged by shadows into a mirror on the second floor. Gradually, the four realized the terrible truth. The ritual had not simply opened a temporary door to another place. It had created a permanent connection, and something had come back with them, something that now watched patiently, waiting for the right moment to complete what had begun on that fateful night at 3 a.m., when 5 naive young people decided to play with forces they did not understand. 6 months had passed since that fateful night at the Blackwood Mansion, and the 4 survivors were never the same again. Separated by geographical distance, but united by an experience that no one else could understand, they maintained daily contact, sharing the strange phenomena that continued to haunt their lives. Jason, who had locked his grandfather's watch in a safe, still found it on his desk every morning at 3:33, no matter how many precautions he took. Sarah abandoned her anthropology studies and now dedicated herself to researching ancient texts of spiritual protection, sleeping in a room without mirrors or reflective surfaces. Daniel had burned his manuscript dozens of times, only to find it intact, The next morning, with new pages that seemed to predict future events in a coded language he slowly learned to decipher. And Olivia, who never touched a camera again, swore that she occasionally saw Michael from the corner of her eye, not as a ghost, but as if he were trying to return from somewhere between dimensions. Most disturbing was the growing sensation that they were not just being observed, but studied. Objects changed places when they weren't looking. Strangers with empty gazes followed them in the streets, disappearing when confronted, and each of them, independently, began to dream of the same thing. The antique clock in the center of the circle, its hands moving slowly to mark 3 o'clock, and a voice whispering that the true ritual had not yet ended. Researching more deeply, Sarah discovered mentions of a mirrored ritual, a second part that should be performed exactly 1 year after the first contact, to permanently close the door they had opened. Without it, the connection would only strengthen until the barrier between worlds became irreparably thin. As the anniversary date of the ritual approached, the 4 friends realized they faced an impossible choice: ignore what they had learned and continue living in a state of growing terror, or return to the Blackwood mansion and try to complete what they had begun, knowing they might be walking directly into a trap. The decision became even more urgent when Daniel deciphered one of the messages in his manuscript. 4 entered, 5 left. The implication was clear and terrifying. Something had returned with them that night, something that now lived among them, using the appearance of one of them, or perhaps of people they encountered in their daily lives. Could they trust each other, or was one of them no longer who they appeared to be? On the eve of the anniversary, they gathered again, each bringing the knowledge and protections they had accumulated during the year. Fear was palpable, but so was determination. If there was a chance to rescue Michael and seal the door they had recklessly opened, they needed to try. As they drove in silence down the dark road leading to the Blackwood mansion, the clock in Jason's car marked exactly 3 a.m. At that precise moment, all electronic equipment in the vehicle failed simultaneously, and a dense, unnatural fog descended upon the road. Through the foggy windshield, they saw the silhouette of the mansion in the distance, its windows now illuminated by a pulsating bluish light, as if the building itself was alive and eagerly awaiting their return. And perhaps, in some sense, incomprehensible to human minds, it was. What happened on that second night at the Blackwood mansion remains a mystery. Some say the 4 young people simply disappeared, joining Michael in oblivion. Others claim they managed to close the door and returned, changed but whole. There are those who whisper about 5 strangers who appeared in different cities on the same day, with the same names and faces as the missing students, but with something indefinably wrong in their gazes and behaviors. The truth, as always happens with the most persistent urban legends, remains obscured by time and fear. What we know for certain is that the Blackwood mansion was mysteriously consumed by fire that night, leaving nothing but ashes and blackened foundation, and that to this day, residents of the region report that if you pass by the property at 3 a.m., you might hear the distant ticking of an antique clock and young voices reciting words in a language that no living being should know.